I followed Jeff down to the basement, keeping a few feet behind him as he wheezed and grunted his way to the landing. I suspected he didn't get down to the lowest level of his home very often. By the time he unlocked the heavy wooden door, his face was flushed and sweaty. "This is it," he announced, ushering me into the concrete room. "It's a bit messy, but—" I looked around. A single mattress, old and frayed, rested in the middle of the floor. It was surrounded by dozens of boxes of all shapes and sizes, as well as furniture shrouded in blankets. A barred, grimy window was positioned near the top of the wall, letting in a narrow square of sunlight. "Nah, it'll be fine," I said. $50 a week, right?" "That's right." Jeff hitched his pants as high as they would go under his bulging stomach. "You can use the bathroom and kitchen upstairs, too. Just clean up after yourself and replace any groceries you take." I nodded and approached the mattress. There were more than a few disconcerting stains on it, but Jeff had been considerate enough to leave a stack of clean sheets, blankets, and a few pillows at the bed's foot. I dropped my backpack, which held the entirety of my worldly possessions, beside the bed. "You can move the boxes and stuff around to give yourself more room," Jeff said, hitching his pants up again as he backed toward the door. "Most of it's junk anyway. Never got around to cleaning it out. But there's some tables and a chair and stuff you can use. Just don't break anything and we're good, okay?" "Sure," I said. "Thanks, man." Later, Jeff grunted, closing the door behind himself. His huffing and groaning echoed through the room as he pulled his large frame up the stairwell. I turned back to the basement and gave it a closer look. There was dust everywhere, and some of the boxes looked as though they hadn't been opened in decades. When my girlfriend and I had broken up, we'd said some pretty rash things. In retrospect, "No, don't bother. Keep the flat. I'm leaving," was one of my less thought-out statements. I was between jobs and didn't have much in the way of savings, so it was pure good fortune that a friend at uni had told me how his Uncle Jeff wanted to rent out his basement. It wasn't pretty, but it was cheap and didn't come with a contract, so I couldn't complain much. I made the bed quickly, out of eagerness to cover up the yellowed stains more than anything, then started working on making my new home more livable. There was hardly any room to stand, so I began pulling boxes away from the bed and stacked them against the wall as high as I could reach. Moving them caused showers of dust and grime to rain down on me, sending me into sneezing fits. One of the boxes rustled suspiciously. Whether it held mice or a cockroach nest, I couldn't have been sure, but I shoved it out of the way as quickly as I could, and then dusted my filthy hands on my pants. I pulled the drapery off the furniture to see if any of it was useful. I found a spindly wooden rocking chair, which I set under the narrow window, and a small round coffee table that could double as a bedside stand, and a place to eat dinner. I was tempted to make use of the giant mahogany wardrobe that was missing one door, but my clothing storage needs were better met by the coat rack I found and placed beside the door. Most of the other furniture, the broken washing machine, the unplugged mini-fridge, the bookcase, and the foldable camping chairs, weren't much use, so I replaced their cloths and left them where they were. One final piece of furniture, tall and narrow, was nestled in the corner behind boxes and a few crates of what looked like children's toys. Hoping it might be useful, I struggled to it, but when I pulled away its cloth, I was disappointed and a little disturbed to find a mannequin. The naked figure stood nearly a head taller than I did, and it was made of a smooth, slate-gray ceramic. Its masculine face was tilted upward to gaze at a corner of the room. It looked shockingly lifelike, even though its features were only abstract imitations of the real things. The smooth surface below its eyebrows gave the impression of a steady gaze, even though the face had no eyes. The lips were set in a hard line below high cheekbones, and its arms were held out in some unfathomable gesture. Its long fingers were devoid of nails, creases, and fingerprints, but somehow they seemed just as human as my own. I threw the cloth back over its bald head and rearranged the fabric to ensure every part of the mannequin was covered. Then I replaced the boxes and crates in front of it. My back was aching, and I figured the room was about as organized as I could bother making it. Dust and whirls of grime still coated the floor, and my every step kicked up small puffs. I hadn't found a broom during my cleaning, but I suppose Jeff wouldn't mind if I asked to borrow his. I jogged up the stairs and let myself through the door at the top. Jeff's house was large, and he'd only shown me the way from the front door to the basement. As I hesitated on the landing, wondering if it would be less rude to go looking for him or to call his name, my phone beeped. I pulled it out and saw 2 missed messages. One from Tony, asking if I wanted to meet him in the guys at the local pub to celebrate my breakup, and another from Clive, saying that they were all waiting for me. A grin slid across my face as I texted back, saying I would be there in 10 minutes. Forgetting the broom, I raced back down the stairs to get my wallet and jacket. I watched the signal on my phone as I descended, and the bars disappeared about halfway down the stairs. Clearly, the basement was a dead zone for Wi-Fi. It was annoying, but I was willing to put up with a lot in exchange for cheap rent. I opened the door and froze as I felt eyes watching me. I looked to my left and saw the mannequin's head, barely visible above the stacked boxes, staring in my direction. I dropped my phone into my pocket, then circled the boxes to escape the gaze of the statue. I mustn't have put the cloth on properly, I realized. A breeze from the open door had probably caused it to slide off. A minute of puffing and clamoring got me next to the mannequin. I gathered the fabric from where it was pooled around his feet, then threw it back over him, being extra careful to make sure it would stay put before I extracted myself from the storage area. The pub wasn't far from Jeff's house, and I got there in good time. My 4 friends were already halfway to drunk, so I made quick work of a pint of beer to catch up to them. When Clive asked me to share some of the ways my ex had wronged me, Tony had the bright idea to turn it into a drinking game. We ordered a tray of shots and drank every time I told a story that made my friends hoot in disgust. They were predisposed to hate my ex and eager to drink, so it wasn't long before we were plastered. We left, or we might have been kicked out. I really can't remember. Shortly after midnight. I don't have any memory of finding my way home, but I did, which was a bit of a miracle, truthfully, as I'd only ever been there once before. I remember fumbling with my keys for what felt like an eternity before I realized I was trying to use the one from my old apartment. When I finally let myself into the house, I tried to creep towards the basement so I wouldn't wake Jeff, but I had forgotten where it was and ended up looping through the house twice before I found the right door. If Jeff heard me, he was generous enough not to disturb my drunken roving. I woke up the next morning with a dry mouth and a splitting headache. I lay there, prone on my dust-covered mattress for as long as I could before my bladder threatened mutiny. I pulled myself to my feet, ready to stagger upstairs, and nearly walked into the mannequin. It stood at the foot of my bed, its arms splayed out as though to welcome an embrace, its head tilted down to angle its non-existent gaze on me as I slept. I stumbled away from it, becoming tangled in my bed sheets, slipped and caught myself on one of the boxes. My headache flared, and for a moment, I thought I would be sick on the floor. Then, as I closed my eyes and breathed the dusty air through my nose, memories of the night before filtered through my mind. I remembered spinning around with Mannequin, laughing at how serious he looked, and telling him he was almost stiff enough to be a replica of my ex. For whatever reason, drunk me must have thought it would be a brilliant idea to pull the mannequin out from the corner of the room and set him up to watch me as I slept. I cursed, shambled around the statue, and stomped up the stairs. I slept in my clothes and still had my wallet in my pocket, so after relieving myself and splashing water on my face, I decided it would be less painful to go outside than hide in the cramped, dusty basement. I went to one of my favorite local cafes. There was a corner with dim lighting, and the servants knew me well enough that they wouldn't pester me too often. So I hunkered down to drink coffee and wait out my hangover. By the time I felt like a human being again, I was late for a uni lecture I couldn't miss and had to jog to get there on time. Afterward, Tony invited me to tag along for a dinner at a barbecue one of his work friends was throwing. In the end, I didn't get back to Jeff's house until late that night. When I opened the basement door, I was surprised to see the mannequin standing beside the rocking chair under the window. I paused in the doorway, confused and alarmed, until I realized Jeff must have moved it. When he hadn't seen me that morning, he'd probably come downstairs to check on me and found the mannequin poised above my bed. It must have confused him and likely disturbed him a little, so he'd moved it. Great. Now he thinks I put the mannequin there on purpose. Talk about making a first impression. I sighed and half-heartedly kicked my bed sheets back into an approximation of where they should have been, and then flopped on top of them. When I split from my ex, I'd left just about everything I owned at our apartment, including my clothes, my laptop, and my uni books. I would need to ask for them back soon, but I dreaded having to carry them the 20 minutes from her apartment to my new basement. I supposed I could ask Tony for help. He was a solid friend and would brave my ex with me like a champ, but I was still holding out for slightly nicer, less cramped accommodations, preferably without a mannequin. I rolled over to look at the ceramic figure. He stood beside the rocking chair. His arms hung limp by his sides, and his face was turned to observe the door. His sightless gaze was disquieting, even when he wasn't looking at me. Sighing, I got up, approached the mannequin, and gripped its arms. The fake skin was colder than I'd expected, almost as if he'd been sitting in a fridge. I shuddered, ground my teeth, tightened my grip on the muscular biceps, and began dragging the statue back toward the corner. It was heavier than I'd expected, and I was winded by the time I reached the crates and boxes blocking me from his corner. It was incredible that drunk me had managed to pull him out the night before. I looked at the boxes, judged them to be too numerous and heavy to struggle with, and decided it would be easier to leave the mannequin on my side of them. I pushed him into a gap between two boxes, turned him to face the corner, and borrowed the cloth from the top of the mahogany wardrobe to drape over him. When I was done, it was almost possible to pretend he wasn't there at all. I went upstairs to brush my teeth, shower, and check for messages on my phone. When I got back into the basement, I barely spared a glance at my cloth-covered companion before sliding into bed. I rolled over to face the window and lay there for almost an hour before sleep finally claimed me. My dreams were disjointed. I imagined I was in uni, taking an exam I hadn't studied for. Whenever I looked at the words, they squiggled across the page like worms and resettled in new places to form completely different questions. A tall, dark man with a smooth face stood beside me while I struggled to erase an incorrect answer. And as I watched the words writhe across the pages again, he bent down to whisper in my ear, "Close your eyes." I sat up with a jolt. Pale light filtered through the window, telling me it was morning. I fumbled for my phone on the bedside table. The clock on my phone confirmed it was just after 7, so I got up and searched for fresh clothes on the coat rack. I only had 3 shirts and 2 pairs of pants, and they were all grimy with subtle dust. Grumbling, I shook one of the shirts and a pair of pants, sending plumes of tiny hairs and specks swirling in the early morning light, then pulled on the clothes. As I made for the door, I shot a glance at the mannequin. It was no longer where I'd left it, between the boxes. I froze, then rotated slowly, my eyes skimming the room. It wasn't hard to find him. He was posed directly behind the head of my bed, staring down at where I'd been laying just a few moments before. A stifled laugh spilled out of me. I glanced about the room, searching for some explanation, and failing to find one. The mannequin stood, legs spread on its stand, his bald head tilted downward. His abs caught a hint of shine from the window's light. I jumped through the doorway, slammed the door behind me, then jogged up the stairs. The house was quiet. Jeff probably wasn't awake yet. I let myself out through the front door, slung the backpack over my shoulders, and jogged down the near-empty street toward my favorite cafe. I stayed there for several hours, stirring a cold mug of coffee and trying not to think about the statue in my new home. I needed someone to talk to who would listen patiently, wouldn't think I was crazy or stupid, and give me solid advice. Well, Tony can do 2 out of 3. Just before the lunch crowd started filtering in, I paid my bill, then took the subway to Tony's neighborhood. It was a neglected part of town, but the occasional windowsill potted plant and a small park stopped it from being depressing. I let myself into Tony's apartment complex, climbed the 3 flights of stairs, and knocked on his door. He was home, luckily, though he looked as though he hadn't been awake for long. His round, oily face split into a huge grin when he saw me, and he pulled me into his cluttered 2-room apartment. "How you doing, man?" He shoved a pile of clothes off his couch and waved me into a newly freed space. Then, before I could answer, he asked, "Want a beer?" I certainly did, and he fished 2 bottles out of his fridge. As I opened my beer, he sat next to me and fixed me with his brilliantly carefree smile. "What brings you here on such a lovely day?" I took a gulp while I tried to think how to phrase my problem. Even Tony, who fervently believed in the Loch Ness Monster, had limits to what he would swallow. I settled on a vague answer. "Something weird is happening in my new apartment." "What, like the house owner?" No, he's fine." Things suddenly fell into place, and I felt acutely stupid for not seeing it sooner. An explanation. The only plausible explanation, really, for the moving mannequin was Jeff. He'd come down to the basement while I was asleep and put the statue behind my bed as a prank. It was a weird thing for him to do, and it definitely pushed the boundaries of personal space. Still, that was less disturbing than imagining the mannequin was sentient. I snorted and gulped down another bitter mouthful of beer. "You know what? It's nothing. Don't worry about it, man." Tony shrugged and turned the TV on. He was quickly absorbed in a soccer match, and I let my mind wander. Jeff had seemed like a jovial person when I'd met him. He was probably waiting for me to bound up the stairs screaming about walking mannequins so he could slap my back and have a laugh at my expense. Well, that wasn't going to happen. I loved a good prank, but the mannequin was just too creepy to tolerate. When I got back, I would have to confront Jeff and ask him not to move the statue again. I didn't follow soccer, but Tony did, and it was an easy, distracting 2 hours. Tony kept fishing more beers from the fridge, and around mid-afternoon he phoned for a pizza. When I left Tony's house shortly after sundown, I was slightly drunk and much less anxious than I'd been that morning. The air was cool and smelled like rain was on the way. I took my time walking home, taking detours through the nicer parts of town to prolong my freedom before retreating to the basement. When Jeff's house came in sight, I hesitated, then quickened my step. The 2-story house stood out like a beacon. Every light in the place was turned on, and the front door stood open, spilling a rectangle of gold down the steps and onto the sidewalk. I stepped in the doorway and listened to the heavy steps thundering down the back of the house. A moment later, Jeff rounded the corner, his large face beat red with exertion, carrying a suitcase in each hand. He saw me and let his breath out in a rush. "You're back. Good. I was going to write you a note." He dropped his suitcase beside the door, wiped the back of his hand across his damp forehead, and gazed about the room. His watery eyes scanned the stack of mail on the narrow hallway table and the phone on the wall. "Did something happen?" I asked, eyeing Jeff's suitcases warily. "If he's leaving, does that mean I need to find a new place to stay?" Jeff caught my gaze and gave me a grim smile. "Don't worry, I'm not kicking you out. I've got to be out of state for a couple of days, lad. I'm sorry to do this so soon after you've moved in. It's my sister. She's had a fall, and I need to be there for her." He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and rubbed it over the rivulets of sweat slipping down his face, his eyes again scanning the room. "I don't think I've forgotten anything. You can use whatever's in the fridge if you like, so it doesn't go off. The bills are all paid, so no worries there." "I'm sorry about your sister," I said. But Jeff didn't seem to hear me. A taxi honked from the street, and he grabbed his travel cases. "That's for me, lad. Gotta go. I'll call if I'm going to be away for more than a few days. Take care now." He barreled past me, dragging his suitcases toward the waiting taxi. I closed the door behind him, then watched through the curtained windows until the car disappeared. Jeff had left the lights on in the house, so I went through each room, turning them off. He must have only just gotten the call. A mess of clothes lined the floor around his closet, and he'd left the bathroom cabinets open after collecting his toiletries. The offer of free food was too tempting to pass up, so I grabbed some leftover chicken and a soda from the fridge for my dinner. I took a shower, much longer than I would have dared if Jeff had been in the house, changed into a pair of clean clothes, and set my phone to charge. Then I allowed myself the luxury of watching TV in the living room until tiredness started to gnaw at me. It was getting close to midnight when I made my way down the stairs into the chilly basement. I didn't think Jeff would mind my using the rest of his house while he was gone, but it wouldn't feel right to sleep in his bed, no matter how inviting it was compared to my stiff mattress and dusty concrete room. The mannequin stood where I'd left him, poised over the head of my bed. I closed the door behind myself, dropped my bag beside the coat rack, and picked the mannequin's discarded cloth off the floor. I threw it over his head, blocking his horrible blank profile from my sight, then dragged him back to his proper place, wedged between two boxes near the opposite side of the room. "Looks like it's just you and me for a few days," I said grimly, patting the mannequin's covered head. "Lovely." I turned the light off and stood by the door for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. The rectangular window set high in the wall let in just enough moonlight to guide me back to my bed. I kicked off my shoes and crawled under the sheets, shuddering at how unexpectedly cold they were. The rooms upstairs had felt so warm and comfortable that it had been easy to become drowsy. But back in my basement, the tiredness melted away. I lay on my back, frustrated and alert, my eyes seeking out patterns in the stained concrete ceiling, while the weak moonlight gradually eroded shadows and built new ones in their place. "You've got to get some sleep," I thought after checking my phone and seeing it was creeping up on 1 a.m. "You've got classes tomorrow, and you really need to pick up your laptop and study books. Brave the fiery wrath of the Dragon X." I slipped into a thin, unsatisfying sleep, where dreams blended into reality. The light from the window was fading, like a flashlight whose battery was running down, while the mannequin strode past me, his ceramic joints bending unnaturally as his blank eyes bored into the back of my head. The door gave a soft click, and I jolted into awareness, sitting up and rubbing my face while I tried to center myself and shake off the dreams. The noise had been too real, too close to have been my imagination, so I fumbled for my phone. I swiped to turn on the flashlight and then pointed the thin glow toward the basement door. A tall, dark man stood there, still as stone, staring down at me. I stared back, horrified. My heart was beating into my ear like a bird trapped in a cage, thrashing its wings against its prison. Not daring to move, I sat in my bed, prepared to dive backward to defend myself the moment the man moved toward me. The stranger, barely visible in the thin light of my phone, had frozen as well. I could feel him watching me, waiting to see what I would do. His stillness was unnerving, terrifying, and somehow much worse than motion. The seconds stretched out, each one lasting much longer than they had any right to, while we each waited for the other to make the first move. Then, a horrible, crazy thought filtered through my head. What if it isn't an intruder? What if it's the mannequin? I glanced to the right, to where the mannequin should have been propped between the boxes. The phone's light was too weak to make out much more than a cloud of shadows, but I thought I caught sight of the cloth pooled on the floor. Then darkness poured over us. My phone had slipped into hibernation. A weak, terrified sound escaped my lips, and I swiped the phone again, calling the light back. I looked up. The mannequin had moved a full 2 paces toward me in that second of darkness. He was frozen again, poised just shy of the foot of my bed as he loomed over me, his fingers spread by his sides, his blank face angled down at me. I clambered out of bed, the adrenaline lending my shaking limbs strength, and darted backward away from the mannequin. I kept my thumb rubbing over the phone screen, refusing to let it slip back into darkness as I pointed the screen toward the mannequin like a priest uses his cross to ward off a vampire. I kept backing away, refusing to take my eyes off the statue's back until I reached the door. I grabbed for the knob with my free hand and twisted it. It stuck. I pulled harder, pushed, then put my shoulder against the door and shoved it as hard as I could. "He locked you in," a nasty voice in my head whispered. "He's got you trapped." "No," I muttered. I stepped away from the door and searched for the plastic box set in the wall. I found the switch and flicked it. Beautiful, sweet light filled the room. I took a series of short gulps of air as I put my phone back into my pocket. I didn't dare take my eyes off the mannequin, but he hadn't moved since that second of darkness. I returned to the door again and jiggled the handle. It wouldn't budge. The spare keys were in my jacket's pocket. I edged around the perimeter of the room until I reached the coat rack, where I fumbled for my corded jacket. The first pocket was empty, so was the second one. I kept going, turning out every pocket in it, until there was no more room left for doubt. The keys were gone. They'd been there when I'd let myself into the basement the night before. I remembered putting them back in my pocket before taking off the jacket and hanging it up. And if there was no one in the house except for me and... I stared at the mannequin's muscular back. He wore no clothes and had no pockets. If he took the keys, what did he do with them? The concrete floor was icy cold under my hands as I knelt before the door. There was a gap of nearly an inch between the wood slab and the ground. I spared a glance toward the mannequin to reassure myself he hadn't moved. Then I turned my head and looked under the door. The short hallway leading to the stairs was almost pitch black, but a thin sliver of light stretched along the ground. I could just barely make out a glitter of silver at the foot of the first stair, offering tantalizing freedom that was impossible to reach. A crash, a snap, and then the light was gone once again. I scrambled away from the door, stumbled to my feet, and turned to get my back against the wall. The light from the window had faded as the night progressed, making it impossible to see anything except vague hints of shapes. I tugged my phone back out of my pocket, my eyes uselessly scanning the black room, and swiped it on. The mannequin stood beside the light, barely a foot away from where I'd been kneeling. His body faced the wall, but his head had turned to follow me. He held something white in his hands. I stared for a moment, extending my phone forward to push the weak light toward him. He was holding a crumpled plastic rectangle with severed wires trailing from it. The light switch. "You bastard," I whispered. The mannequin didn't reply. He was frozen in the beam of my phone, the indents where his eyes belonged gazing at me. Once again, I felt the overwhelming sensation of being examined, as though his fleshless, lifeless eyes could see far more clearly than my mortal ones. I skittered sideways toward the window to get out of his gaze. Panic was building like a knot of cords in my chest, binding my lungs so I couldn't breathe, and restricting my limbs so I couldn't move. The waning burst of adrenaline was urging me to do something. Flee, fight, just some sort of action. But my exit was locked, and I would rather have died than touch the monster in the basement. "That's what you are," I said, backing toward the window, my feet scraping across the dusty floor as I warded him off with a light from my phone. A monster. The back of my legs hit the rocking chair, and I let myself slump into it. The rickety legs creaked under my weight, but it didn't break. My mind scrambled to find a way out, but every choice was a dead end. The window above me was too narrow for a person to fit through, even if I could break it open. My phone had no signal in the basement. The door was too thick and solid to break, and without the keys, I had no hope of unlocking it. I glanced past the mannequin. If I could find something, a coat hanger maybe, to slip through the gap under the door, I could probably hook the keys. But that would mean turning my back to the mannequin again. I instinctively knew that was a terrible mistake. Well, it was dark at least. I tilted my head back to gaze at the window above me. It was narrow and it had bars like a jail cell's, but it let me see a strip of inky sky pinpricked with stars. If I could hold him off until dawn, I might just have a chance to retrieve the keys and make a break for it. I looked back at the mannequin. He remained as motionless as a statue, posed by the defunct light bulb, looking the other way. "Light's your weakness, huh?" I said. "You can't move as long as I can see you?" "As usual." There was no reply. I kicked my heels against the ground, sending the rocking chair into a gentle swing. How long until dawn? I turned the phone toward myself for a moment. 3 a.m. I had at least 2 hours until sunrise. I rotated the phone back to face the room. The mannequin had moved. And the second I'd taken the light off of him, he dropped the scrunched plastic from his hand and taken a step toward me. My breath whistled through my lips in a shaky wheeze as we stared each other down. My first impulse was to move out of his line of vision as I'd done before, but I stopped myself. I didn't want to show signs of weakness in front of my stalker. "Maybe this is best," I told the mannequin, while the light jittered over his slate gray face. casting strange shadows about his eyes. I can watch you, and you can watch me, but no one gets any closer than we are now. Time dragged by. When my arm began to ache, I switched the phone to my left hand. I didn't dare break the mannequin's gaze, even as the shadows behind him jumped and leapt in my dim light, clamoring to surge forward and engulf me and my inhuman companion. As the air became colder, goosebumps rose on my arms, and mist began to plume in front of my face. A couple of times I thought I saw tiny puffs of chilled air appear around the mannequin's set mouth and ceramic nose, but it might have been a trick played by the light. It was easy to lose track of time in the basement. I kept my chair rocking, using the gentle motion to keep me alert. Each time I kicked against the floor, the worn wooden joints whined in protest. I had my eyes trained on the mannequin, watching the shadows around his eyes quiver as the light shifted from the motion, as I willed myself to stay alert. Then my phone beeped. I knew that noise, and a rush of frantic horror poured through me. I stopped rocking the chair, letting it come to a halt as my feet hit the ground, and stared at the statue with fresh dread. The beep was my phone's warning for low batteries. How didn't I think of this before? It's been on for hours. Of course the battery is going to drain. My mouth was dry when I swallowed, and I felt a small bead of sweat trickle down my neck. I imagined the light going out, dead beyond my power to summon it back, trapping me in the inky blackness with my inhuman companion. A strangled noise caught in my throat. Calm down. Think. Where's the charger? Upstairs, of course, where I'd left it after fueling the phone before bed. Damn it, I whispered. Damn it, damn it, damn it. My hand shook, and the unsteady light allowed the shadows to creep across the mannequin's shoulders and up his legs. The way the darkness danced made his face look as though it were moving. How much battery do I have left? How much time? I eyed the statue, calculating the risk of taking the light off him versus the agony of not knowing how long my battery would last. Then I turned the phone toward myself as quickly as I could. He was in darkness for less than half a second, but when the light returned to him, he'd taken a long step forward. Damn you to hell, I snarled at him. I had 15% of my battery left. I'd charged it just before bed, so having its light on was sucking its power quickly. A headache set into my right temple as I tried to calculate how long that would give me. It was just after 5 a.m. Surely dawn isn't far away. I remembered a quote, something I'd read in a novel years before, which suddenly felt much more personal. The game of patience has changed into a game of endurance. There was nothing to do but wait and hope. I kicked against the ground again, setting my chair back to rocking. I divided my attention. I still watched the mannequin, but I couldn't stop myself from flicking my eyes toward the window above my head. I kept expecting the fresh morning light to break through the black, but if anything, it seemed to be getting darker. I struggled against my desire to check the time. Taking the light off the mannequin for even a second would give him the freedom he craved. But the slow crawl of time was agony. When my limbs were trembling from exhaustion and cold, and my eyes were bleary from staring into the dim light, I couldn't stand it any longer. I flipped the phone around to face myself, then immediately turned it back on the mannequin. He'd taken another long step forward, halving the distance between us. I recoiled in my chair, and the pained squeals of its dry wood filled the basement. I'd seen 2 important things in the moment I'd been able to look at my phone. First, it was 5:42 in the morning. I couldn't remember what time dawn broke, but I suspected it wasn't long after 6. Second, and much more horrifying, my phone's battery was down to the last 2%. As I held the shaking light toward the mannequin's face, I thought his thin, stern lips looked a little different. Maybe it was the exhaustion or the stress getting to me, but they seemed to have curled into a grim smile. No, I said, using both hands to hold the light, to stop my numb fingers from dropping it. No, don't come any closer, don't come any closer, don't come any closer. I kept the chant up, gasping thin breaths in between and stealing frequent, quick glances at the window, desperate to see any sort of abatement in the smothering darkness. The mannequin, ever still, ever patient, watched me with those intent, eager eyes. I met his gaze, shook my head, and then my light died. "Here it is," Jeff said, huffing as he unlocked the basement door. "I haven't touched anything since I got back." Tony followed the wheezing man into the basement, taking in the surroundings in a quick glance. He recognized his friend's jacket and shirts hung up on a coat rack, as well as the backpack sitting by the door. "He didn't take anything?" Tony asked, crossing the room and glancing at the unmade mattress on the floor. "Not that I can tell," Jeff said, rubbing the back of his hand across his forehead. "Weirdest thing. He cleared out while I was visiting my sister. Didn't write a note or anything. He left the key at the foot of the stairs, though." Tony stooped to pick up the phone that had been left on the rocking chair. He pressed the power button, but the battery was dead. "Well, if you hear from him, tell him to get in touch with me. Tell him I'm worried. And his professors say he'll fail if he misses any more classes." Jeff nodded grimly. "You want to take his stuff?" "I guess I'd better." Tony grabbed the clothes and phone, stuffed them into the backpack, then followed Jeff toward the stairs. At the threshold of the room, he glanced back, searching for any sign of where or why his friend had disappeared. He saw nothing except the unmade mattress on the floor, the stack of boxes pushed against the walls, the dilapidated rocking chair sitting under the grimy windows, and 2 slate-gray ceramic mannequins standing against the back wall.